Welcome back to Passion Point, a show about your passion, your purpose, your potential. My name is Irene Becker, and I'm thrilled to welcome Maureen Brown, Canada's #1 diversity trainer, a woman who is changing the landscape of organizational business in Canada by helping to create greater engagement and helping to optimize our diverse workforce. I'm very proud to introduce Maureen Brown. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you.
Maureen, you've had an extraordinary career, from journalist to diversity trainer who's worked with the federal government, provincial government, municipalities in Europe. I want to hear about your passion, your purpose, your potential, and how you have built a business and an incredible skill set and become one of the top diversity trainers by using your 3 Qs: enhanced IQ, brain power, emotional mastery, and SQ, spiritual quotient.
Sure. I began my career as a journalist. Growing up as a child, I always loved communicating. So it was taking information in, doing something with it within my mind, communicating it out, engaging the reader or the listener. And so I became a journalist and did that for a couple of years. Within that time, however, the intellectual aspect of engagement was not fulfilling enough for me. I needed to engage at a deeper level. And so I began to do a lot of research. And one of the topics that caught my interest was what we now know as diversity. Where in interviewing and in conducting focus groups and various types of strategic engagements, I began to realize that it's more than what a person has at an intellectual level that causes change to happen. It's when people become engaged at an emotional level. And so that engaged my emotion. And with that, I began, and I can give you some more detail
on how your passion.
It became my passion to engage people at that level. And then the spiritual aspect of it, as I became a diversity expert or specialist or expert, I began to realize that there is still a third dimension. Mm-hmm. And it answers to the question of how do we, when we are different in so many ways, gender, race, sexuality, how do we create bridges across which we can go to each other? And that's the spiritual level.
Maureen, at a certain point in history, we were both very different. I mean, I ran a steel company in the late 80s when I was the only woman, I think, CEO of an industrial business in the country. I'd always been a minority. I happened to be Jewish, which makes me a minority. But for the first time in my life, I became a visible minority. In an era where I don't even think we spoke about diversity training, it wasn't a reality. I became a Martian in my arena. I was the only woman. I was a visible minority. I was discriminated against actively. And it left me with a passion for human purpose, passion, and potential. And our incredible ability as women or people who've come from a minority background to make a difference. As a woman of color, how did diversity first speak to you? Was it through an experience that challenged you?
For me, believe it or not, when I was practicing journalist, and I had opportunity to cover a story in a community that was marginalized not only on racial terms but socioeconomically as well. And that is when I began to realize that my own diversity racially was one aspect, yes, of how I am marginalized in society, but I also realized that I did have some assets that made a difference. So I was an educated person. I did have English as my first language. I was familiar with the society and so could move around. I became aware that there are people, these are things I take for granted, and there are people who can't take this for granted. And this happens within organizations as well, where, yes, we're all here, but when you really begin to dig below the surface, you find that there are people, many people who are not engaged. And so that becomes my passion. I want to help companies have not just people who come to work, who show up, but people who buy into the corporate goals and people who fully contribute to what is happening in the organization.
What you're saying is that you can't make a contribution, you can't engage, you can't be most effective. You can't really create a better bottom line unless you have the freedom to be, unless you can really optimize your potential as a minority group or as a minority person or within a diverse culture.
That's right. And so, for example, one of the mottos in our company, Diversity Trainers Plus, we say we help people to create stronger systems. So you think of human resource practice, for example, hiring, recruiting, training, equipping people to work in the workplace. We make systems out of that. And that's fine. I create systems as well because you need to systematize it so it's consistent and sustainable. However, the people part of it, and people are, are divided, within people there is their emotional self, there is their intellectual self,
yes,
and there's their spiritual self. And so I believe in marrying the two, and so people then become more fully engaged and as such are able to take the company to the direction it wants to get.
Well, when you think of the cues in terms of working smarter and IQ, emotional mastery in terms of being happier, communicating better, having greater influence, and SQ in terms of really tapping into the universal values that sustain us all. How does that speak to you in terms of your platform?
Well, take the intellectual aspect, for example. So in many organizations today, there are people who intellectually are very similar. They've gone to the same schools, they have had the same kind of work expertise backgrounds, and because of that, they get hired. Many, however, do not give overtime. They may not offer what we call discretionary effort. And the thing about discretionary effort is that little extra that you give, not because you're asked, but because you want to give it. And no employer can pay for that. That is what happens when people are engaged at the emotional level, when people feel that their spirits are not being suffocated by being in this organization, then they give their discretionary effort. And that's what makes me come alive when I work with an organization to not only devise a system, but also to help bring alive the people who are going to motor and power that system, whether it's in your communication approach or your management approach or your strategic planning approach. It's all about people and then the systems that people create, systems of thought and behavior.
When you think of discretionary effort, though, would you not say in this economy that it is a must?
It is a must, and that is why more and more organizations are seeing diversity and what we call diversity, not just as something that's nice to have, which it is, not just because it's legally required, which in a few instances it might be, but more and more organizations are seeing this as a business necessity. People are your most valuable asset. Your human capital is your most valuable capital because an individual can choose to give more than they're being paid for. And so if you're in an organization, for example, if my religion, say for example, requires me to wear a certain, let's say a hijab or a kippah, and when I enter that organization, if that organization does not have a systematized way where people are held accountable for the way they treat their colleagues, and what might happen is people may feel it is okay to make jokes about what I'm wearing, and that reduces my engagement in the organization.
And creates something that has become an epidemic in the United States, presenteeism, where people show up for their jobs but they're not really working. Maureen, we're going to be back after the break. I want to thank you so much.
Okay.